Hi, good morning, everyone. How are you? Welcome. 8 o'clock. You're here, bright and bushy-eyed, bushy-tailed. Is that what it is?
Yeah.
Bushy-tailed. Welcome. This is session number 33. Hopefully, you're in the right place. CE Document Preparation 101. My name is Matt Allred. I'm the Internal Communications Manager for UDOT. And so it kind of means I'm the jack of all trades. If you're a comm guy, communications guy at one of these conferences, you're everywhere. So you'll probably see me a couple more times today, I'm sure. Anyway, wanted to welcome you this morning. A couple reminders and a couple things. Please make sure that your cell phone is turned on to silent. I know that seems like a funny reminder, but just it's common courtesy. If you need to take a phone call, please, I know some of us are still working and we need to take phone calls. If you need to, please be respectful of everybody around you and just take it out in the hall. We would appreciate that. So today's presenter is Jennifer Elskin. Elskin, excuse me. Elskin, excuse me.
We didn't practice.
We didn't. Jennifer was easy. Jennifer's an environmental program manager for NEPA and cultural resources in our UDOT's Environmental Services Division. So she has over 10 years of experience in NEPA, transportation planning, and environmental document preparation. So with that, this is an easy introduction.
Okay.
Time is yours.
Very much.
You're welcome.
Hey, thanks everybody for coming this morning. There's plenty of seats up front. Feel free to come up front. And I know it's early, maybe you didn't have breakfast. There's granola bars around the room. Feel free to pass them around, have a little snack. We have a variety. And there's a bag of taffy if you really need like that big sugar rush this morning. Then you have that, if this isn't going to be like enough of a rush. So what I want to do today is kind of give you just an overview of CEs, categorical exclusions, which that's kind of a mouthful, so CE for short. Just give you an overview of what they are, what that means, what the regulation is, where that comes from, kind of go through how we do them at UDOT, what our program is, and then I'm going to open up EPM and actually do a tutorial for you. I got a lot of handouts as well, so you'll walk away with something in hand that you can use later, and hopefully you'll find that really useful. So CE, short for categorical exclusion, and that's a class of action under NEPA. And so this is the regulation where it actually defines what a CE is. That's the CEQ regulation that implements NEPA. And you'll notice it says individually or cumulatively have a significant impact. Is anybody familiar with NEPA? How do we determine what's significant? Does anybody remember? Context and intensity. So it varies based on your project. It's not always a black and white line, what is significant or what's not significant. And it also says for which neither an environmental assessment nor an environmental impact statement is required. So EA or EIS, those are the big documents that we do, the ones that get a lot of attention, take a lot of time. So if you think about it, it's a class of action that's defined kind of on what it is not. So it's a class of action that's based on the exclusion from having to prepare an EA or an EIS. So FHWA in their regulations has defined it a little bit further than that. Similar, so it has to meet the requirements of the earlier statute, but then also based on past experience, based on past projects, in the regulations, FHWA has come up with sort of a list of projects that are typically considered a CE. If you've worked with NEPA, you've heard that referred to as the C&D list. So what I have, maybe somebody can help me pass these out. We probably don't need all of these. So I have a copy of the regulation for you, which actually goes through the definition, then also that list of C&D list, the specific list of C&D list projects. And if you notice in the regulation, what it says is a CE is a project that does not have significant impacts, that does not have impacts to, for example, cultural resources, historic properties. So it defines it as basically what it's not. And you also notice it doesn't say that it's excluded from NEPA. A lot of people think if it's on the CRD list or if it's a CE, it means it's excluded from NEPA, and that's not true. It's excluded from the requirement to prepare an EIS or an EA, which is a little bit different. It's kind of semantics, but it's a little bit different. So it doesn't give you a hall pass. It doesn't mean that your project's good to go or that you have a blanket clearance. It also says that it's excluded from requiring further FHWA approval. So it doesn't mean you don't have to do any documentation. It just means you don't have to get an additional approval. So every state kind of handles it a little bit differently, especially in terms of how they distinguish what they document on a C-list project and what they document on a D-list project. So I'm going to talk mostly about what we do here in Utah. The guidance from FHWA basically has been that you should at least document your decision. So you don't have to do a full document. You don't have to go through that whole process like we do here. We do it as more of a QA/QC process. You could document it as a class of action letter, a memo to file. There's a lot of different ways you could document that. Something else to consider, though, is that just because it's excluded from the need to prepare a separate document doesn't mean that it's not excluded from any other environmental laws. So, for example, you still might have a consideration under Section 106 for cultural resources or Section 404 for wetlands that may not initially be considered if you're not doing a full document. So here are some examples of C and D list projects. These are probably the most common ones that we do here in Utah. The first 5 or 6 are the ones that are specifically on the C list. The ones at the bottom are the ones that are on the D list that are a little bit more complex. And actually the D list says that, so the C list is a little bit more specific, that, you know, we've identified this list of projects that doesn't need additional approval. The D list is more examples of projects that may or may not need additional approval based on a review of the project. So with MAP 21, FHWA was tasked with doing some environmental streamlining measures. So what they did is they created some new C-list categories to kind of reduce the need, or not reduce the need, I guess, sort of increase the number of projects that would require less documentation and review, is the way to think about it. And what they also did is they took some projects that were on the D list and they moved them to the C list. It didn't really make a huge difference for us here in Utah since we treat everything on the C and D list the same. But for states that do treat them differently, that was an additional streamlining measure for them. So I have a handout for you as well. So Caltrans, we can't take credit for this, it's from Caltrans, developed a couple fact sheets that go through the differences between the two changes, the new C categories, and then the changes for moving from the D list to the C list. So there's actually 2 fact sheets. They're double-sided and stapled together. That's why there's a 1 and a 2 on them. And it's actually a really good resource that explains the criteria for those different categories. For example, the 2 of the new ones that they created, C22 and C23, if I remember correctly, and I'm probably going to mix them up, but one is projects that are within the operational right-of-way can be considered a C-list project, and that was kind of a big thing. And then projects with financial constraints can also be considered a C-list project. So operational right-of-way, if it's not the entire right-of-way, your fence line might be a lot larger, but it's what's considered the operational part. So if you're maintaining a center median, for example, for a clear zone or a safety, I don't know what the engineering term is, but like a little safety area, if you have a really wide center median that's not developed, you might have resources in that area, and so this allows an additional streamlining where you could consider a project that was located within that center median on the C list, which is a little bit different than what we did before. And then also the fiscal or financial constraints. So if you have a project that has limited federal funding, and it's under a certain amount, I can't remember what it is, you could also consider that on the C list. And that also gave you an extra category so that if you have a project that isn't neatly fitting into one of those other categories, it might fit into the C or D, or the C22, C23 category. And then also with moving the top 3 D list projects up there, 1, 2, and 3 to the C list, those are probably the bulk of what we do here in UDOT. D1 is, we call that highway modernization. Basically, those are like road-to-mill and overlay projects, pavement reconstruction, auxiliary lanes, all falls under D1. And then D3 is the bridge rehabilitation and replacement. We do quite a bit of those in UDOT as well. But the caveat is, now that these are on the C list, there are constraints, meaning you can't have an adverse effect to historic properties. You can't have an individual 404 permit, changes in access control. That would bump it out of the C list category. So you can see the need with those constraints to have that additional documentation and review of your class of action. If you look at a project and say, oh, it's a bridge rehabilitation project at C26, boom, I'm done. What if that bridge is eligible? Replacing it is now an adverse effect, so you have an issue under 106 and also a 4F review. So just something to think about, which would actually kick it from a C26 category to another category on the D list, which is D13. So it still allows it to be processed as a CE, it just doesn't easily fit into one of those categories. So you can see kind of the, I guess, mistake in logic there. If you think, well, it's on the C list, I don't have to document it, I can just move on, because you might be missing other resources and you actually might end up misclassifying your project. So with UDOT, we have a memorandum of understanding that we executed with FHWA in 2008, which allowed FHWA to delegate to UDOT the authority for approving CEs. And those we call delegated CEs. They're kind of changing the word a little bit. They're calling it CE assignment instead of delegation. It's just kind of a subtle legal interpretation there. So in UDOT, we distinguish our CEs between what we call delegated CEs and documented CEs. So a delegated CE is a project that's already on the C or D list, and we can process those in-house and actually approve them here at the UDOT level. Projects that can be categorized as a CE but aren't on the C or D list, we can still process those as a CE, and we call those documented CEs, and those are actually approved by FHWA. We don't do very many of those, probably, I don't know, half a dozen at the most a year. And those are projects where we might be adding capacity to a road, but it's not a big enough project to determine that it needs to be an EA or an EIS. Those are probably the most of the documented ones that we do, is that they're an adding capacity type project. Yeah. 4700 South in Region 2 was a documented CE. Region 1 just did one, SR 37. Those are the two most recent ones. I do have some examples of CEs. I didn't bring a documented with me, but I can get you one if you wanted to look at it. They tend to be almost like a mini EA. We don't review alternatives, but they tend to get pretty lengthy documentation. There's usually a pretty substantial amount of right-of-way acquisition that happens with those. So we would be doing like a full cultural survey and most likely a wetlands delineation and a noise study, and so they get kind of lengthy. So also with our CE assignment, we have a lot of reporting requirements that we need to do. We have a semi-annual report, essentially, that we send to FHWA that lists everything we've done in the past 6 months. And then we also do a self-assessment report. The reporting varies on that, but I think now we're at an 18-month cycle where it actually goes back through everything we've done. We kind of do essentially an audit on ourselves. So even though they're reviewed and approved at the region level, Central Environmental will go back and do an audit on those CEs and double check for a list of things. And I'll get into that a little bit later when I talk a little bit more about the whole CE process. But things we look for are, was it categorized correctly? Are the preparer and the reviewer two different people? Are all the questions on the CE answered correctly? Do you have all of your memos, all your documentation? And if you don't, that it goes into the error category. And so we have to report those errors back to FHWA and then work on methods internally at UDOT to reduce those number of errors. And we're actually pretty good. I think over the past, I'd say 4 or 5 years, we've had like 95% or more with no errors. So we're actually pretty good because built into the whole CE approval process are several QA/QC steps that I think really help reduce those number of errors. There's a lot of sort of checks and balances in that whole process. So that's another reason why, because of our CE MOU, that we do that additional documentation here and actually do have an approval on our CEs instead of just doing a memo to file or some other, like a short form documentation. So, I mean, we're always open to, you know, new ways to do it and new ways to streamline it, but that's one reason we kind of do it to the extent that we do now. So, we use, so here at UDOT, if you're familiar with EPM, you can log into EPM, and we actually have, it's like a web-based online form that you can use to do your CEs, and it'll prompt you for everything. It will, there's certain cases, and I'll show you a tutorial later, but there are certain cases where if you answer it wrong, you'll actually get an error box that pops up and says, you know, you can't have 2 no's to these questions, you know, you have to, you know, you have to go through your list of questions, or like in terms of whether or not you need public involvement. If you answer too many no's, it'll prompt you and say, no, you need to check with Central Environmental. It'll prompt you when you need memos, things like that. And then basically what it does, it'll keep track of all the different steps. So by the end, it'll tell you whether or not your document's complete. If you've missed a step, you can go back and find it and correct it. And then it'll basically generate a PDF form, and that's what we consider our CE document. So our CEs, we do probably about 120 to 150 a year. That's throughout the state. Every region is pretty equal as to how many they do. Some regions sometimes are a little bit lighter, some are a little bit heavier, it just sort of depends. But it's the bulk, really, of what we do, even though EAs and EISs take a lot of time and attention, and they're multi-year projects, and you know, those are the high-profile projects, but really CEs are the bulk of what we do every day. For something that's pretty simple and basic, you can actually get it approved with, you know, a month or 1 to 3 months. They're pretty short documents. That's assuming everybody's workload is open and available, you're not doing a lot of surveys or anything like that. And then once you actually have all of your clearances that you need to sit down and actually do a CE, you could probably do it in about a half hour. So, you know, they're pretty short, they're pretty quick. If you do need to have surveys done or agency consultation or a public meeting, they could take a lot longer. It just depends on how complex your project is, what kind of resources, where they are. So there's a lot of variety with a CE as to how long it could take. Generally, we try and complete them by plan in hand. If you're familiar with our project delivery network, it's built right in. There's actually a task that's assigned to preparing the CE and approving the CE. And it fits in, I think, if I remember correctly, before the plan in hand design meeting. So that's usually our goal. Sometimes they don't get approved to PS&E, which is fine as well. NEPA has a stipulation that you can't go beyond 30% design in your NEPA process, but 30% design is a little bit flexible as to how you interpret that. A lot of people interpret it different ways, but we generally shoot for plan in hand, sometimes PS&E, but you can't advertise until you have a signed document. That's the absolute drop-dead date. So at the very latest, our submit for advertising, when we submit it to the complex, when the region submits it to the complex, would be when you absolutely have to have a CE completed. And they're approved by the region environmental manager at the region level. If a CE gets completed outside the region or reviewed outside the region, it still comes back to the region to do that final approval, since the region environmental manager has sort of that ownership for their program. And then we archive them in ProjectWise as well, so they're part of the project file, if anybody needs to look at that later. So just some things to consider. Make sure you have that correct category. That's probably one of the major issues with the CE, is not classifying it correctly, or going through EPM too quickly and selecting the wrong one on accident. That happens sometimes. Project scope. We all know project scope changes throughout the life of a project. If you have changes to your scope, that's going to likely require a change in your document. You can kind of offset that a little bit and be a little bit proactive by working with your project manager. For example, if you have a road-to-mill overlay project, and let's say it goes from milepost 2 to 5, double check and make sure, is it really milepost 2 to 5, or is it 1.7 to 5.3? You know, the construction crew doesn't always stop exactly at that milepost, so double check that. You can always do a little bit extra in your CE if you need to kind of avoid having to redo the document later and to kind of capture potential changes. For example, this happens a lot with a road-to-mill overlay project. They decide later on to add in rumble strips or replace guardrail or do shouldering. So if you think that might happen on your project, just work with your project manager, or if you're a consultant preparing it, you know, double check with the environmental manager. You can build that into your project description. You can say, based on final design, these other elements might get added in based on field conditions. We might decide to replace guardrail. And if you don't do it, you're fine. But if you do it and you didn't account for it, you'd have to change your document. So just something to consider to make it a little bit easier for yourself. So even though CE documents tend to be pretty simple, pretty quick, they still might need public involvement, maybe a public hearing depending on the project. You might still need surveys, agency consultation, Native American consultation, and all of that can add time to your schedule. And then you have to consider what might happen after your document's complete. You might still need a permit, you might need mitigation, there might be restrictions on construction if, you know, constructing during nesting season and you have to avoid that, or if there's resources that might come very close to your project, especially in areas in Region 4, archaeological sites or wetlands that are within the right-of-way and might come very close to the pavement. That might be an avoidance issue. So just things to consider. So we try and carry that throughout the whole project into the plan set and communicate with the RE so that they know about those things. But sometimes it's easy to forget with a CE. You think it's, you know, quick and easy, I'm done, I'm good to go, and it's also not a blanket clearance for the entire right-of-way. So these are sort of the main elements of a CE. So purpose and need is key. So I have purpose and need guidance. This is available on our website. The other things I don't think are. So for any environmental document, purpose and need is key. That's sort of what sets up your whole framework for your project. It's the goal you're trying to accomplish. It's the justification for the need for the project. Without a purpose and need, you know, your project just sort of can kind of unravel pretty quickly. So even on a CE, when it's a quick and easy document, even though there's not a requirement to do this document, you still need a good purpose and need. A purpose and need is not a project description. That's one of the things we check for when we do our audit with the CE MOU, is that your purpose and need does not include elements of what your construction activities are going to be. So for example, the purpose of your project is not, you wouldn't say something like, the purpose of this project is to replace this bridge, or the purpose of this project is to reconstruct the pavement. That's a project description, that's an action item. So your purpose and need would say something like, the purpose of this project is to improve safety, or relieve congestion, or add capacity, or address pavement concerns, things like that. And then your need is sort of like the data that backs it up. You know, you have a deficient bridge, you have potholes in the pavement, you have traffic backing up at a signal or whatever. That's the data that sort of backs up what the goal is and kind of justifies why you need to do this project. So for a CE, especially just a regular C&D list project, it doesn't have to be really long. It could be 2 or 3 sentences, but you know, it's good to put something other than just, you know, the project will improve safety, period. I mean, or the purpose is to improve safety. I mean, you need a little bit more than that, but it doesn't have to be super complex. The project description is the solution. So one way to think about it is the purpose and need is the problem, and the project description is the solution. That's actually what you're going to do. That's You know, we're gonna rotomill off pavement, and we're gonna put new material down, we're gonna replace the bridge, and it should also include all those related elements. And again, sometimes, you know, this early in the project, you don't have all of those details, but you should put in the details that you know, or what you can reasonably assume are gonna be done. So if we're replacing a bridge, we're probably tying in and, I don't know what you call it, with the approach slabs, you know, you're probably addressing the approach slabs. Or if it's an interchange, is it with the on-ramps and off-ramps, things like that. If you're putting in a new signal, are you carrying it back to the turn radius, things like, you know, you want to include those kinds of elements. But it's very specific about what the project is and what the proposed action will actually do. And it should include locational information. We have similar sounding locations all throughout the state. So if you say, we're putting in a signal on 100 East and Main Street, I mean, that could really be anywhere in the state. So it's good to identify the specific state route, the milepost, and then local information, such as street names, city and county is always helpful. It doesn't have to be super long, but just if anybody's looking at that, they can look at that and have a clear idea. So even though it's on the cover sheet, you know, the project description, the name of the project will have that information. It doesn't always. So it's good to just be as specific as you can without, you know, going overboard, I guess. So.
Hey, Jen,
Yeah.
can you talk a little bit about how specific you need to be in the project description? For example, paving type, barrier, cable barrier.
I guess it depends on if it would affect the outcome. So if changing the barrier type might affect impacts to resources or affect your evaluation, it's good to know that. But you can also be vague and say we're putting in, you know, like a center median and material type. It might be a Jersey barrier or it might be cable barrier. You know, so it's good to know. Sometimes it's kind of a balance between getting too specific and kind of tying yourself in, and then being too vague so that you're not exactly sure what the project is. But you can say things like, you know, if you want to say between approximately, you know, milepost 2 and 5. So you have a little bit of wiggle room. Or you can say, you know, we'll be rotomilling approximately 4 to 6 inches and replacing with appropriate pavement type, and you can even identify it and say, you know, probably, however you want to say it so it sounds nice, HMA, but if you change to a different type of material, that's probably not going to change your project. So if that makes sense. With things like changing from asphalt to concrete might, but then again, it may not. So you kind of just have to use your own judgment. But I think it's good to at least allow yourself some flexibility so that when the project gets into final design, if something changes, you kind of have it written so that you don't have to redo your document if you don't need to. But if you say that, let's say you're going to replace guardrail but not the foundations, and then let's say out in the field, they look at them and decide, well, we need to replace foundations, but now we also need to regrade that area. That could be pretty substantial, you know. That could be an impact, so.
Jen?
Yeah.
So I found that in some cases, the CE can actually push the engineers to make a decision. And I don't know if that's the intent of the CE, but if you've got a question about signage and the decision needs to be made, or if the direction is to make the decision and to put all of the work items in the description of the CE, sometimes the CE writer will have to go to the design group and say, well, what are you guys doing with your signage? Well, we don't have an answer on our signage yet. Well, what do I write in the CE in order to capture the fact that they either haven't had a decision yet on the signage? Is it possible to say may include signage? Would that be acceptable?
Yeah, and you have to, so in those cases, it would be better to be a little bit more conservative and say, yeah, they might include signage and that might include replacing the post. But if it's a situation where replacing guard, let's say you have, this happens, I guess, in Region 4, or you went to Basin a lot, where you have archaeological sites or wetlands that are coming right up to the edge of pavement, and if how you write that CE affects those resources, you either have to let the designer or the PM know, well, if you change that in the field, you have wetlands right there, and you either have to decide now, are you going to avoid them, or are you going to impact them? And if you're going to impact them, we might need a delineation, we might need a permit, and that could force them to decide, okay, we're not going to do that on this project. Or at least they know up front, so that when the RE comes back, you can say, well, I told you were going to need additional, environmental review, and now we have to do that. And you can actually build that into your description as well. You can say, it's basically based on the information we have today, here's the proposed project. If that changes, it's going to need additional documentation. Or, there are wetlands adjacent to the project area. We've defined the project area as this. If that project boundary changes, that way you've identified it up front. So, I don't know if that answers your question.
It just means
So-
that coordination with the designers is absolutely key. I mean, you just can't assume that the first blush that they give you is gonna be the one that sticks.
And there's always hidden stuff, and we've all been to kickoff meetings where everybody was invited and not everybody shows up, and they show up at PS&E, and all of a sudden maintenance is, oh, well, we want to do this, this, and this. And we're like, well, we didn't talk about that. So you just have to be proactive, and you just have to, keep coordinating, keep asking, and saying, okay, well, this project was a lot like this project, and we did this other stuff here. Are you going to do it here? And if not, you just have to make sure that they know, well, if we stick to this description, you're good. But if you change that, you're not. So, yeah. Sorry, I don't have it's never black and white. It depends, right? That's our favorite answer, is it depends. Okay, so the next part would be your resource evaluations. The basic three are, we need cultural resources, T&E, and wetlands. Kind of depends on the project. Again, it depends. But most likely those are going to be the three big ones that you need. You don't always need surveys, but you might. There might be, if not a full survey, at least somebody needs to go out and kind of check what's happening in the field and just double check and verify that either we are avoiding something or we do need a survey and make that decision. And then some of that depends on weather as well. We can't do archaeological surveys when there's snow on the ground. Or you can't survey for Ute ladies' trusses, but they only bloom in like July or something, right? So that can affect your schedule as well. You can always avoid that, but you just have to know in construction, if that changes, that could change your project. And I've already talked about mitigation measures. You might have other BMPs and avoidance measures that need to get captured in that document, and you want to make sure it all gets captured in that document, since that's the record of everything, right? That's the record of all of your evaluation considerations. So at the end, and I'll show you this, once you've finished everything in EPM, there's an option to print, which essentially generates a PDF. You assemble everything, you save it as a PDF, as a nice clean document, and it should all be one document, not the PDF form and then separate PDFs for all of your other resource memos. It should be one PDF document. And that'll get reviewed and approved and then entered and saved in ProjectWise. This is just a list of all your parts and pieces that would go in your document. The signature page is generated from EPM. You have your whole CE document. You need a project map. We're working on a consistent type of map. Right now, every region, everybody does it different. There's no requirement to have a big fancy map. You can just do a screenshot from Google, you could, whatever. But as long as there's a map that's clear, that shows the location, that somebody not familiar with the project could look at that and understand where your project is. Sometimes it's just a point, a line. It could be the map from the plan sets. You could use that. It could be a topo map. You have a variety. All of your clearance memos. If there's any mitigation measures or permits, you need to have those listed. And then other supporting information. So if you do have an adverse effect to a cultural resource, you need to have a signed MOA in the document. It needs to be signed before the document's signed. You need to have all of your surveys complete. Resource consultation. I know you don't get the 404 permit until after the environmental document's done, but whatever consultation you need to do with the Corps needs to be done before the document's signed. Noise study, wetland delineation, air quality, whatever it is. Usually we don't put the cultural report into the CE. That gets submitted to SHPO separately, and a lot of times it includes sensitive information, so we usually don't put that in the CE. It's not wrong if it's in there, but we usually don't. And so it can get kind of lengthy with all of that stuff, but not every CE will be that long. So. We do not need a title page or a cover page or a table of contents. We try and keep these as brief and simple as possible. The way EPM prints them out, it almost prints out a different resource on every page, and there's a lot of blank space. So we don't want to make them any longer than they have to be. So we really don't need that. If it's a documented CE, those can get kind of long. Again, we don't need a cover page. Sometimes on a documented CE, because they're so long, it's nice to have, or even a table of contents, but it's really not necessary. And same with appendix cover sheets. If it's a short CE, it doesn't really make sense to put in a cover page for each separate appendix, like here's your project map and here's your cultural memo. I mean, it just sort of it's a lot to kind of scroll through, right, on a PDF. But if you have a lot of stuff, what you can do is just at the start of your appendix, just have a list of items so that you know Appendix B is your map, and Appendix A, Appendix B is whatever documentation. If you did a public meeting, sometimes there's, comments and the proof that we advertised, and so it doesn't get all jumbled. It's nice to kind of separate it out, but you really don't have to do anything fancy. And usually when I was at a region, when a consultant would send me something that had a cover page, honestly, I would just delete it. I mean, some consultants feel like you really need that because it makes it look all pretty, but really don't do that. Okay, reviewing and approving CEs. Now, a lot of this happens, or I should say, the approving part happens at UDOT, so consultants really aren't involved in that, but if a consultant is preparing a CE, they're most likely reviewing it as well. And it can happen either way. UDOT can review and approve, or the consultant can review and then we approve. There's no specific requirement either way. The only actual requirement we have, and this is part of our CE MOU delegation, is that the preparer and the reviewer cannot be the same person. And so when we do our audit at Central, when we find that, that's actually an error that we have to mark and report back to FHWA. So that's like absolutely no. The preparer and the reviewer cannot be the same person. And we can tell when you've kind of fudged that a little bit. Like, we can tell who did it. We know who did it and who didn't do it. So really, just there's enough people in environmental for the work to be spread around. The repairer should be a completely separate person who's entering into EPM, and a reviewer is a completely separate person who's reviewing that PDF. There's no specific requirement that the reviewer and the approver be a different person, but we strongly suggest that you do that. And again, this is more for UDOT than a consultant. So if you have a reviewer and a preparer, or a reviewer and approver the same person, most likely we're going to come back and say, you know what, next time find somebody else to review your CE. It's just one extra step. It's really easy to review a CE, and then as the approver, I guess it gets too jumbled. So if you have a review and approver be two separate people, it's like one extra QC step, and it's easy to catch those things. If you're reviewing and approving, it's easy to just gloss right over and not notice that one button was answered differently, or catch spelling mistakes. So that's really our preference. It's in our environmental MOI. So even though we don't count it as an error category in our audit, we strongly encourage that. So one thing that's really helpful is the reviewer's checklist. So this is something we developed as part of the CE MOU, sort of our QC process. And we use it as literally just a checklist to go through when you're reviewing a CE. But I think it's good for any document. It's good for consultants to have as well before you submit something to UDOT, just to go through and double check and make sure you have the key things that we're looking for. Make sure you have all of your clearance memos. They should all be signed, or I should say, letters that need to be signed. It should be the signed version in the CE. For Native American letters, we want a copy of the signed one, because if it's not signed, how do we know it really got sent out? Same with like a DOFO that we send to SHPO. We need to have proof that SHPO concurred, so we need to have that signed copy. Do you need more? Oh, okay. Oh yeah, I forgot to send those around, sorry. Just some key things we look for when we're reviewing, which are also some of our audit items. Proper category, make sure it's from the C&D list, the proper category. As I mentioned, different preparer and reviewer. Purpose and need and project description. As I mentioned, they're two distinct different things. Your purpose and need is the problem you're trying to solve, and your project description is your solution. Don't muddle those up. That's an error, actually, that we have to report. All your clearance memos, and if you need any permits, make sure you identify those. That's probably not very clear. That's just an example of the reviewer's checklist that I just sent around. So some common challenges. Scope changes, I already talked about that. If you have changes to the scope, that's most likely going to cause changes to the scope or changes to your document. Accurate project descriptions, and we've talked about that a little bit. Just making sure that it's clear, that it's easy to understand, it's not too vague, you don't need to be overly specific, it includes the items that it needs to include, it should match the project description on your clearance memo. It doesn't have to match word for word, but there's been times where I've read a clearance memo that says something completely different, or not completely different, but it has like a couple sentences that are different from what the project description says, or vice versa. So it makes me wonder, you put it in the project description, but did that resource specialist have all the information they needed when they wrote their memo? Or did they write the memo and then later the scope changed? Did that get captured? Most of the time, it's not that big of an issue, but it could be if they missed, if they weren't aware of an action that might impact, an archaeological site or a wetland or something like that, it might make a difference. Auxiliary lanes versus through travel lanes. They're not the same thing. If you're a designer, you're familiar with the Green Book that actually defines them. But an aux lane is a passing lane, a climbing lane, a turn lane. A through travel lane is literally just that, a through travel lane. So you have to be really careful when you're writing your description that if your lane is truly an aux lane, it needs the data in your CE needs to support that, and your project description needs to support that. It's really easy to confuse them, and it's really easy to write through travel lane when what you're really talking about is an aux lane, and vice versa. And they're two different kinds of documents. If you have an aux lane, that's a documented CADX. If you have a through travel lane, no, I said that backwards. If you have an aux lane, that's a delegated CE. If you have a through travel lane, that's a documented CE requiring FHWA approval. It's adding capacity, completely different. I had a project recently that it came to me for review, and there were a series of right turn only lanes, and they wanted to restripe and make those through rights. Well, that's actually adding capacity based on where the project was, the length of the lane, what else was happening. The problem they were trying to solve was a capacity issue and congestion and a lot of other things. So it wasn't just like, oh, now we have a through right. No, it was actually, you do that far enough, you kind of end up with a through travel lane. So you have to be really careful with how you describe that and how you justify that. The same thing with adding capacity and relieving congestion. And sometimes it'll come from a concept report where it gets written as a capacity project, but it's really not a capacity project, because you can relieve congestion without adding capacity. There's a lot of different things you could do, and maybe your project is really trying to solve a congestion issue, not adding capacity to meet future travel growth. So it's kind of splitting hairs, but under NEPA, it kind of makes a difference, and it can make a difference with the kind of document you do. So those are things that we see a lot. If you're not sure, just ask your environmental manager, ask your project manager, go back through the project file, make sure everybody's clear, and make sure you're all talking about the same things before you get too far into the environmental document. Because if you do need to do a documented CE, it's a lot easier to decide that up front, and we can do some things to kind of not expedite the process, but make sure that it's not going to hold up your project. Whereas at the very end, if we find out it needs to be documented CE, you know, that's going to affect your advertising schedule and your construction schedule. Not planning time for surveys, and also keeping in mind that you might have impacts to other resources. Historic bridges are a common one I mentioned. C28 is bridge rehabilitation and replacement, and on a bridge that's not eligible or a bridge on the interstate, that's fairly easy. But if it is an eligible bridge and you're replacing it, that's going to be an adverse effect. So if you have to make sure that you plan for those kinds of things. And then prairie dogs in southern Utah, we all know they like to burrow in our right-of-way, and we have a biological opinion with Fish and Wildlife as to how to deal with prairie dogs, but it's something you have to consider, and it could add extra time to your project, either in completing the CE or limitations on construction or pre-construction surveys that have to happen before your project actually begins construction. So some additional resources, be sure to visit our website. Our environmental manual instruction is on there. Some of the documents I passed out are on there, and some other guidance about our CE MOU, our Section 106 PAs, the biological opinion I talked about. So make sure you check that out. And then I think I passed out all the handouts. If you didn't get them, they should be floating around. And I have extra copies if you want to take them back for somebody in your office who couldn't make it today. Some of those are on our website, some aren't. And then my contact information is there. So if I can get the internet to work, I'm going to pull up EPM, and we're actually going to do a CE. And I know it's early. If you haven't had breakfast, there's some granola bars, so make sure you get a granola bar. And then what I'll need you to do is, based on the type of granola bar you select, get into groups, and we're going to do a little group activity. I'm just kidding. See, you all paid attention now. Group activity. Yeah, Eric.
Okay, I just had one question.
Yeah.
It's confusing about the word significance that you used to change the words. You use the words, and I've heard it before. It's,
Context and intensity.
so apply that to public controversy, and apply that to right of way. I mean, where it's almost seems to be almost as vague to use those two words as it does significance.
So that's how NEPA defines significant, is based on your context, the project location, your environment, and then intensity. How intense is the impact or your potential impact from your project? So with a CE, and it's kind of, I mean, it changes on every project, right? It's not black and white. It's subjective. You have to use your best professional judgment. And that's one reason that NEPA isn't done in a vacuum. That's why you talk to your stakeholders and you have public involvement. You can have an adverse effect. You can have impacts to wetlands. You can have an individual 4F impact and still be considered a CE. So that doesn't necessarily trigger significant under NEPA. So it's based on a combination of factors. So you could have, let's see, so you could have your impact, and let's say you think, well, it's an adverse effect, that's a big deal. Under Section 106, for that resource, it might be significant, but based on your overall project, considering all factors, considering everything that project is doing, is that really a significant impact to that location? And it might be, but it might not be. So a CE doesn't mean you don't do anything. It doesn't mean there's no impacts. It just means it hasn't risen to the level of needing to prepare an EA or an EIS. And it's balancing. So I don't know. Does that make sense? Yeah. I mean, yeah, I know. And I know what you're talking about. And yeah, that could be, but it might be significant to that one group, that one stakeholder, but is that a significant impact for the entire public, that entire town? And it may not be. So there might be some concern, there might be some interest in that project, but it may not be controversial. So, and every project is different. So, I don't know. But I think in that case, I still think a CE is appropriate. I mean, it still fits under D13. So we're talking about a project that is a road and mill and overlay project that's also going to involve some shoulder work and curb and gutter that will impact a historic ditch, a portion of a historic ditch, which is an eligible cultural resource, but it's not impacting all of it. It's only impacting a section. There's some concern from a local group, but we don't know yet if it, so far, it just seems to be the local historical group, so. So it's like, it could be an adverse effect, you know? So, yeah. Did that, I don't know if that helped.
I wasn't talking just about that project.
Oh, okay. Yeah, but it just comes back to context and intensity, and that's, you have to just weigh all the factors. You look at all your resources, you look at everything that project's doing, the location, public involvement, all of that, so. Sean, did you have a question?
I was just thinking about like a noise study then. So if you did a noise study and you had an effect, but you mitigate to that, does that still stay as a cat? Because you mitigated?
Oh, because you mitigated down? It could.
But, so if you do have an effect, does it kick it up to higher level?
Maybe, maybe not. Context and intensity. I don't know. Okay. So to get to EPM, there's a link on our website. Uh-oh. Hopefully I can get into EPM. If you need access to EPM, I think you go through consultant services to do that. Yeah.
A note about that last window that just popped up,
Mhm.
updating Java. Don't do it, because if you update Java to the most current version, you won't be able to access EPM without some significant changes. It has,
Whoops.
you'll have to back it down if you do update it.
There's all kinds of funky stuff with,
If you try to log on to EPM and you can't get into it, it may be because you have too new of a version of Java.
no, I got in earlier. There we go. Okay. So this is your home screen. Does this screw you up if I sit down, Dave? Okay. Whoops. So once you log in, the first thing you're going to do is go over to Project Management. The Environmental tab is up here, and it's screen 770. Pretty simple, basic. Oh, I almost forgot. I have examples. So I printed out a few different examples of CEs, so feel free to kind of flip through those. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one that's already done and kind of play with it. I think that might be a little bit easier. So when you, can everybody hear me? Am I too far from the microphone? Okay. So the first thing you want to do is put in your PIN. You can also do a search. Oh, look at that, the microphone moves. You can also search for different pins based on region. You can do a non-pin if for like a reevaluation or a maintenance project. So we use this EPM form for CADXs, but also state studies, maintenance projects, anything that needs an environmental document basically gets this. And you type in your PIN. I think this project is actually floating around the room somewhere. And basically what it'll do is it'll take you to this info screen. And so it'll give you the project number, region. You type in your name, and then you have to hit enter. Otherwise, it won't let you advance, just so you know. Sometimes people get stuck on that screen, but you do have to hit enter. So document type, it's a drop-down menu. So you can pick from a state study, whoops, or a documented CE. If you're doing, I'm not going to go over documented CEs too much, but if you're doing a documented CE, you're going to need you're required to have a class of action letter signed by FHWA, and that gets routed through Central. So somebody at Central Environmental will actually review your letter, send it over to FHWA recommending their approval, and that date needs to get entered. If you're just doing a regular C or D list CE, you don't need that. You just pick Fed MOU, and that's referencing our CE MOU. And then the paragraph here is the list of all the C and D list categories. It includes, it doesn't include all of them. There's about 50 different categories actually identified in the C and D list, but it includes most, and it's the ones we do most often. So you can see some of these how, if you really took it literally, that if it's on the C list, you don't need anything else, boom, you're done. Well, utility installations, installing traffic signals, rest areas, all that kind of stuff. You could see how those might potentially have some impacts. So you want somebody that has some experience with NEPA, some experience with, environmental resources and UDOT and the project to kind of look at that and evaluate and really make that decision that, yeah, we're classifying that correctly. And it just makes good sense to have something in your project file, something in your project record that shows that somebody considered that. And as I said, different states do it differently. It could be a memo to file, a one-page checklist. We do kind of an involved list, but it, it's not a huge amount of time to go through this. So, and this does have the new categories on here. So you just pick your category. They're kind of in order, but like here, it says C2 and then C21 just because how it prints it out. So make sure you're clicking the right one. It's easy to, click the wrong one. They look a little, if they're close together. So this one is a C26, so it's highway modernization. And then it'll automatically get you to the next tab where you do your purpose and need and your project description. But if you click back on document type, there'll actually be a little bit of a description here that actually gives you the information as to how it's defined in the regulation. So if you're not sure, like, is that one highway modernization or is it another category, and you don't want to go look up the regulation, you can just kind of read that again. So here's where it talks about auxiliary lanes, parking, weaving, turning, climbing, not through travel lanes, right? Those are different. One thing with classifying your project, we have a lot of projects that have a mix of things. So, they might go in more than one category. Just use your best judgment. It's usually whatever is the biggest part of the project. So if it's highway modernization, but there's a lot of safety improvements, it might be kind of a toss-up as to which category it goes in. As long as you're close enough where that's an appropriate class of action, it's not necessarily wrong. It would be wrong if you clicked, utility installation when it's really, a safety project. Sorry, I keep hitting the microphone. So if it's obviously a different kind of project, that would be a misclassification. That would be an error that would have to be reported to FHWA. And sometimes that happens just human error. They clicked the wrong box. They just made the wrong call. But if it's close enough, it's not going to be considered an error. And if you're not really sure, if you think it could go in either category, just before you review the CE, just double check with either with the environmental if you're a consultant, check with your environmental manager. If you're at a region, you can always ask me or somebody at Central, what do you think, and that kind of thing. Most of them will neatly fall into one category, though. Next, purpose and need. So there's a few different ways you can do your purpose and need. This one has like the purpose statement last. You could start with your purpose statement and you would just type in, actually I don't want to mess up his stuff here, but go down. And you also have unlimited space in EPM. Essentially, you don't need to type in a lot, but if you do need extra space, you can also do it in a Word document and paste it in. But if you do that, it'll change your characters. So it has this weird habit if you have a, what do you call it, a little apostrophe, EPM will change it to an upside down question mark. I don't know why it does that, but if you are cutting and pasting, just double check and make sure you clean that up. EPM won't spell check for you. It's nice to have things spelled correctly. It's not fine literature, but so, one way you could do this is just start the purpose of the project. See, this is why I usually don't do it right in EPM. I'm a terrible typist. So the purpose is to, oh my gosh, sorry, okay, you get the idea, is to improve safety, and then just explain why that is. And then go on to your project description. This one's actually done really well. SR 224, approximate milepost, approximate length, 1.5 inch rotomill, 1 inch overlay. And again, if that changes a little bit, if it's actually going to be a 2 inch rotomill or 2.5, I mean, I think that's still within the realm. And you wouldn't have to go back and change your document. This one is pretty specific, and then it says will also include, and again, it does say proposed work. So proposed doesn't mean absolute, it just means this is what we plan to do, but there's always some variation. So with our delegated CEs, one thing you want to avoid, and this is true for your clearance memos as well, is you want to avoid using FHWA. So these CEs, the legal responsibility for completing these CEs and for complying with NEPA on a CE project has been delegated from FHWA or assigned from FHWA to UDOT. So that means it's no longer considered an FHWA project. It's a federally funded project, they're a funding source, but the requirement for the federal agency to do the CE because of that federal action has actually been assigned to UDOT. So don't put FHWA is proposing or FHWA plans to do that. And that's kind of a subtle distinction, but it's important to remember. And same with your clearance memos. It's UDOT is proposing. An easy way to get around it is saying, you could say, the project proposes to use federal funds to construct this project. You can kind of get around saying FHWA or even saying UDOT. So with the NEPA assignment that we're pursuing right now for EAs and EISs, there's actually a requirement on documents to put in this little caveat that says, this is being completed under this regulation and it's been assigned, FHWA has assigned their responsibility. So this is it's not required under the CE MOU, but it's a way to kind of show that we understand and we're making sure everybody else understands that FHWA has assigned that legal responsibility to UDOT. So again, it's kind of subtle, but it's something that's important to remember. So this description also states all work will be limited to the existing roadway prism. If that's true, it's good to put in there, but sometimes we put that in there and it's not really applicable to the project. If you want to define your parameters by, toe of slope to toe of slope, edge of oil to edge of oil, that's good. If you want to say, we're limited to areas that have been previously disturbed, it's good to have those kinds of clarifications in your project, but roadway prism may not always be an appropriate description for your project. Sometimes it kind of gets thrown in there. It's also important to remember that your project description is specific to the footprint of your project. It's not always a blanket fence-to-fence clearance within that right-of-way. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. If you have a project on, let's say State Street, which is US 89 through Salt Lake, that's an area that's been developed, obviously, and if we're within the right-of-way, if we clear the whole right-of-way for a project, curb to curb, most likely you're fine. But in areas that are more rural and open, we can't always give a blanket clearance to the entire right-of-way. There could be resources or other considerations in the right-of-way, or it might be a really large area, and maybe the project doesn't allow to actually survey or review that entire area. I think that sometimes that sort of gets lost in translation from the NEPA document down to, on the ground in construction. It's also specific to the project. So just because you had one project there, if you have another project come through that area later, you need a whole new environmental document. It's a different project. It's very specific. NEPA is very specific to a finite action in time. It's not a blanket clearance for all of eternity. You can, if you need to do that on a project, you can kind of do things a little bit programmatically. You can do some planning documents, but it's not a blanket clearance, and you would still have to probably do some reevaluations in case conditions change. You might have historic resources that are now old enough to be considered eligible that weren't considered before. You might have wetlands that have now developed in your right-of-way that weren't there before. You might have to do some reevaluations on your individual resources, so just something to consider. And then also permits they're not a blanket permit for all of eternity either. They're for a specific time and a specific purpose. So I'm not going to go through every single tab unless somebody has, a burning question about one of the tabs or, a specific issue with one of the tabs. But I'll just kind of click through a few. So basically, you just start going through. Each tab is a different resource all the way across the top. And so this is one where if you click the wrong answer, it's going to pop up and tell you, like, nope, that's not appropriate. Oops. Okay. And it goes through right-of-way. Make sure if you do have temporary construction easements or strip takes that you identify those. Tab 5 is for cultural. Make sure you check the right kind of document you need. As I mentioned before, if there's mitigation, a signed MOA must be attached to this document. If you've sent out Native American letters or stakeholder letters, those need to be included. If you didn't, you can just put in the box here why you didn't. We have some PAs with tribes that allow us to sort of programmatically consult where we don't have to send them a letter for every single project. Or maybe just based on the project, we didn't send out letters to local, to CLGs or historic societies or, whatever. You can add in a little bit of information here. So you'll notice up at the top it says document incomplete. So until you go through all your sections and answer all your questions completely, you'll have document incomplete up there. And usually, here. So if you notice this little asterisk over here next to 17, that's telling me that that section hasn't been completed. So when you get to the very end, you can go back to where it's easy to find where you're missing information based on where that asterisk is. It'll also prompt you, I'll go back to 5 here, it'll prompt you, it'll tell you that you need, which letter you need attached, and to make sure you include it. Here's the one for paleo. If yes, a memo must be attached. We often include it in the cultural resource memo, so we don't always have two separate memos. I'm going to click on wetlands and water resources. I think this one's always kind of tricky, especially if you're not familiar with wetlands and water resources. We've tweaked this a little bit, but it's still kind of confusing to read because you feel like you're answering yes when you should be answering no, or you're answering no when it's actually yes. It's written a little weird. But this is one section here where, if you click, maybe it's no. If you click yes here, one of these must be yes. So if you click no to all these, you're going to get a little box that's sort of prompting you to go back and look at these. And I think this is one here, you must answer yes to at least one of these questions. And I think this is one that always needs a little extra review because the questions are really asking you specific things. So again, it's good to coordinate with your resource specialist and make sure you're answering these correctly and making sure you're marking whether or not you need a permit and which kind of permit. And if you have any suggestions as to how we can word that better, we're always open. Yeah, okay. Okay, you got it. Okay, Rod's on it. Good.
I guess if the images will help us.
Yeah, so it's, we've changed this a few times. And I think this last time we tried to make it better, but I'm not sure it actually made it better. I think it just made it shorter. So, and then it's always the question, potential to affect. Well, does it really, does it have potential? Does it not have potential? We have the same thing with cultural resources, so. What?
We take out the not on that question. The project is affected, does have potential to affect or cross waters US.
Okay,
Simple change.
okay.
But your answers are gonna be different.
Yeah, see, that's the,
That's an EPM issue.
yeah, see, that's the thing,
But
so.
if you take the not out of that question, it's
It makes sense? Okay. I do want to point out on this page here, you'll notice all these commitments that have been added in. So if you click, where is it? Here you go. So if you click here that it disturbs 1 or more acre and you need a stormwater, a SWIP, it'll automatically fill that in. So you don't have to worry about filling that in. So you can see it added it in and then took it out. But this project, it's near a tributary of Silver Creek. So there are some avoidance measures and stipulations that the project needs to follow. So to add those in, so some of them some of the standard stuff will auto-populate, but if you have specific things that you need to add in and there's no limit, it's whatever your project needs, it needs what it needs, right? You just click add, and that'll pop up this window here where you can pick for this particular section. So you have to be in the right tab. Is it floodplains, water quality, or wetlands? And then what phase, whether it's construction, maintenance, preliminary engineering, and then you type in your commitment, whatever it is, we need to avoid this area, or we need these extra BMPs, whatever is different than what would be standard for that project. You click who's responsible, whether it's the contractor, whether it's the landscape architect is responsible for that, and the due date, and then you just hit return, and it'll automatically save that. And then it's, rather than putting in, like if you have several for water quality, sometimes it's a good idea to kind of break them out and list them individually. Just depends, especially if there's a lot of different people that are going to be responsible. So you just keep clicking through all your different resources. Air quality is one that sometimes trips people up. And I won't go through the whole air quality thing, but if you answer yes to this second question, it's going to add extra tabs that you need to complete for regional conformity. And then I think if you answer yes, see, then you've got other tabs that pop up. So if you need those for your project, make sure you complete all of them. And then when you click no, you get this nice little happy box that says you're done with air quality, which everybody always likes. But I think I answered that question. I got to fix it now for this project, right? Where's air quality? So this particular project didn't need that supplement, so we'll click no. So you get to the very end. Section 4F is also one that tends to confuse people, especially if you're not really familiar with it. On a CE, you could have all three of these kinds of impacts. You could have de minimis, individual, you could have a programmatic, and you could have a de minimis on a park. It just depends on your project. You just have to make sure you're answering them all correctly and that you have all the correct documentation. Some of this isn't written exactly So we don't do written concurrence from environmental services, but environmental services reviews and approves some of these 4F evaluations. And the bridge, like especially for bridges, we have a shortened evaluation form, we call it a programmatic. But all of that documentation actually needs to be included in your CE. So it gets kind of cumbersome if you've got all the documentation for for your 106 consultation. Your 4F evaluation is actually a standalone document and should be completely sort of self-contained. So you end up duplicating a lot of that in the CE. So it gets kind of cumbersome, but just be sure to include all of that stuff. And then, letters, if you're impacting a park and you have to consult with the official with jurisdiction, you need to make sure you have all your letters and proof of public involvement, and it gets kind of lengthy. So this section tends to be kind of confusing. But in this one we had no. Okay. So when you get to the very end, you answer yes or no, and you can see documents complete, so we've answered all the tabs correctly. As I pointed out before, if there was a tab that wasn't answered correctly or wasn't complete, we'd have that little asterisk up here, so it'll prompt you to go back. So you want to make sure that you have document complete. And it'll show up in red instead of green. And so if you don't have that, if it says document incomplete, when you go to print your CE, your signature page will actually say document incomplete. So just double check for that. And if you get to the end and you answer yes, by the time you get to the end, you should know whether or not your answer is going to be yes or no. And if you answer yes, you'll get this nice little thing that prompts you. And some of this is sort of, when we did this in EPM years and years and years ago, we kind of put in a lot to sort of help people along, kind of prompt them for a lot of things. And we do things a lot differently now. So in case you're wondering why all this stuff is in here. So now you're okay, you're good to go. Oops. Oh. Okay, we have document complete. You want to hit this print. Oh my goodness, this is a sensitive mouse. Uh-oh. Let me go back. There we go. There we go. So you hit this print button, and it will generate a PDF, but it does it in kind of a weird form. So it does it in one of these extra windows. All right, where did my thing go? Uh-oh. Okay. So it kicked me out. Sometimes it does that. If you've worked with EPM, you know it can be a little wonky, right? That is my correct password. What is happening here? There we go. Okay, normally it doesn't do all this. Okay, so it generates this new window with your CE. Shows you everything. You can just save this as a PDF. There's your signature page. But I want to show you down at the bottom, the very end. Here are your project commitments. So it says mitigation. They're not really mitigation. It might be mitigation, but it might also just be project commitments. And so it prints everything. So here's cultural, that's our discovery spec, our invasive weed control. We have our special water quality commitments that we added in. You can see the contractor's responsible for some. This one, the designer is responsible for. That actually saved it. I thought I deleted it, but that's the one, the dummy one that I did. If you do have something that the UDOT designer is responsible for, you want to make sure you coordinate with the UDOT designer before you put this in, just to make sure. So I'll show you, I'll pull up this particular CE. So this one's already been approved. All right, where's my, there we go. So here's the signature page. We have prepared by Adrian, reviewed by Rebecca, and approved by Mason. So 3 different people, so that's a nice sort of layer of quality control there. I'm going to scroll all the way to the bottom. Here's our commitment page again. So here's something that Region 2 does that I think we're probably going to start doing in all the regions. It's a environmental commitments page. So basically, it gives the option for the region environmental manager to go to the project manager and the district engineer and let them know that there are commitments on this project. So if there are no commitments, if it's just standard specs, you know, the standard BMPs, the region environmental manager can sign off on that. But if there are extra things, we want to make sure that everybody sort of that's involved in implementing those is aware of it. And so if we've told the district engineer, likely that will get to the RE. We'd like to be invited to the pre-construction meetings to let them know again. It'll be in the 555. I mean, it'll get carried out in several ways. But I think it's a good way to just sort of document and let people know that there's some extra stuff happening. It's always been kind of a challenge when you have things, when you have all those commitments in environmental and how you communicate them through the whole process. So, oh my gosh, I've been talking for an hour and a half here, you guys. So just really quickly, I'm going to run through all of the appendices. You can see them all arranged. Pretty simple. Let me go back really quick to my CE presentation. And what, couple things I just want to show really quick, if it'll let me through. So if anybody wants a copy of this, I've done a bunch of screenshots to kind of help prompt you through everything. So once it's approved, the environmental manager will go back into EPM and enter the approval date, which is really important. So it captures it as in EPM. It helps right away. It helps finance. Everybody will know that it's actually been done for advertising. We'll put everything in ProjectWise. We like to store all of the parts and pieces, not just the whole document. So if somebody's going back looking for something specific, they don't have to scroll through a big long document. This one, actually, you can see there's a lot of, different parts, and so it's really helpful to have all those different parts. And then the region environmental manager will mark it for advertising. So when they're going through and getting the advertising package ready, they can find it really simple. So sorry, I didn't realize I was so close to the end of time, but that's CEs in a nutshell. Make sure you have all the handouts. I have plenty if you need extra. And then I think we have a little bit of break. So if anybody has a question or they want to look at something in EPM, I'm happy to hang out and talk to you a little bit about that. So any other last minute things before I let you guys go? Okay. That's it. Make sure you sign in. I don't know where the sign-in sheet went. Thanks.